Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. Grab your coffee and put on your senior back-end engineer hats, because today we're tearing down a pretty uncomfortable truth about systems architecture. We're going to dissect exactly why the average metrics on those nice green performance monitoring dashboards of yours are completely lying to you.
Okay, picture this. We've all lived through this classic on-call war story, right? It's 2 a.m., your phone starts buzzing. PagerDuty is literally screaming at you about timeouts and failing user requests. So you groggily pull up your system dashboard and it claims everything is totally fine. It's showing a breezy, healthy 50-millisecond average response time. So why on earth do users complain when your dashboards are perfectly green? It's a disconnect that drives us absolutely crazy.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer mathematical deception happening right in front of us. Just look at the stark contrast between the mean average and reality. On one side, we've got an average latency of 50 milliseconds looking great, but on the other side, a p95 latency that is literally resulting in a user timeout. This perfectly showcases how mean averages mathematically bury the brutal reality of the failures your users actually feel. The average just smooths out the spikes, totally hiding the fact that a small chunk of your users are sitting there staring at a loading spinner that is never, ever going to finish.
So, here's our principal engineer's post-mortem runbook for today. 1. The lie of the average. 2. The tail at scale. 3. The distributed variance multiplier. 4. Hidden sources of latency. 5. Strategies to cut the tail. And finally, 6. Production debugging and SLOs. We know exactly how we're going to dissect and solve this nightmare.
All right, let's dive right into Section 1, the lie of the average. We need to establish the core definitions of performance monitoring.
To truly understand latency, you've got to stop looking at the mean and start obsessing over percentiles. Look, P50 is just your median, the exact middle of the pack. But the magic, or frankly the absolute horror, lives over in the P95 and P99. These metrics represent the literal experience of the 95th and 99th slowest requests out of 100. And you need to understand that P99 isn't just some rare edge case you can ignore, it is the strict boundary of your worst-case scenarios. In today's world, distributed systems live and die in the tail.
Which brings us to this legendary piece of wisdom from Google engineers Jeff Dean and Luis Andre Barroso. They hit the nail on the head when they said, in large systems, rare slow events are no longer rare. This perfectly captures the core insight of modern architecture. As your system grows, distributed systems don't just magically add a little bit of latency. No, they multiply variance across every single network hop.
Which leads us nicely into Section 2, the tail at scale. Let's see what happens when microservices inevitably fan out.
Let's scale this concept up a bit. Think about a single Uber ride request, that one little tap on a phone. It can trigger over 30,000 remote procedure calls across 500 discrete services under the hood. 30,000. When you have 30,000 rolls of the dice, tail events, those supposedly rare slow requests, become an absolute statistical guarantee. It's not a question of if a delay will happen, but how many delays are going to happen on a single user request.
Let's move on to Section 3, Distributed Variance Multiplier. We're moving from theory into the mathematical physics of failure to see how slowness cascades.
All right, brace yourselves for a little shock value. 9.6%. We are talking about an almost 10% failure rate at the overall system level, stemming from just a microscopic 1% chance of slowness on a single node. Just let that sink in for a second. A 99% success rate locally turns into nearly a 10% failure rate globally. How on earth does that happen?
Let's walk through the dice roll here. If your user's request fans out and has to wait on, say, 10 backend shards, and each shard has just a tiny 1% chance of hitting its slow P99 tail, well, the probability that all 10 shards are fast is 0.99 to the power of 10. That's roughly 90.4%. You subtract that from 1 and boom, you get 9.6%. This proves mathematically that if your request waits on 10 shards, the single slowest node dictates the entire user experience. Because you're waiting for all 10 to finish, you are basically held hostage by the slowest one.
Okay, Section 4, hidden sources of latency. Like any good post-mortem, let's look under the hood at the hidden off-CPU wait times dragging us down.
And this brilliantly illustrates one of the classic latency killers, the N+1 query problem. When you have a perfectly optimized database query, it might take a swift 15 milliseconds. But if you accidentally fetch an initial list and then loop through it sequentially, your latency rockets up to 808 milliseconds.
That's a massive 54x performance degradation caused purely by chatty, inefficient database calls.
But wait, there's also the network tax. More specifically, the dreaded sidecar tax. Look, when you implement a service mesh like Osteo for observability or mutual TLS, you're usually moving from super-fast Layer 4 pod-to-pod communication up to Layer 7 deep packet inspection. That is not free. It adds significant overhead. In really large meshes, synchronized 30-second DNS refreshes across thousands of sidecars can create this massive thundering herd effect. It spikes your p95 latency right through the roof, all while the average looks perfectly fine.
Here's the thing. If you are only profiling your on-CPU time, you are completely missing the massive latency generated by these hidden traps. I'm talking about JVM garbage collection pauses, thread pool lock contention, and unbounded queues. Fact is, queuing is where latency goes to grow quietly in the dark. Add in transient network packet loss or a massive cold cache miststorm right after a deployment, and your users are going to feel it. You absolutely must measure off CPU wait times to see the whole picture. Section 5. Strategies to cut the tail. So how do we shift from blindly hoping the network is fast to building a resilient, tail-tolerant architecture? Well, here's the definitive 5-step mitigation runbook, straight from large-scale operators. Step 1. Instrument end-to-end latency budgets per network hop. Step 2. Hunt down your top p95 contributors using distributed tracing. Step 3. Rip out those chatty calls and collapse unnecessary network hops. Step 4. Add tail controls, things like hedging and smart retries. And Step 5. Isolate and load shed before you attempt to just blindly scale up your infrastructure.
Now here is an absolute game changer for your architecture. Deadlines beat simple timeouts because they propagate budgets downstream. Think about it. If your overall request has a 300 millisecond budget and the very first hop eats up 200 milliseconds, the next hop only gets 100. Cascading deadlines prevent those brutal timeout waterfalls. They make sure each downstream service only consumes whatever latency budget actually remains, rather than waiting blindly and locking up the whole system.
Let's rapid-fire some hardcore production advice here. First, request hedging. If a query hits that p95 latency threshold, instantly fire off a duplicate request to another replica and just take whichever one comes back first. Second, use jittered retries to stop retry storms from taking down struggling downstream services. Third, enforce back pressure so you fail fast instead of just stretching out the latency. Fourth, kill your traditional unbounded queues. Seriously, look into high-performance patterns like the LMAX disruptor that use ring buffers to completely eliminate write contention. And lastly, use write-behind caching to batch up your database writes. Every single one of these directly attacks variance. Okay, bringing it home with Section 6, Production Debugging and SLOs. Let's see how this ties into real-world incident response.
If you actually want to keep this slowness in check, you absolutely have to enforce a strict, documented service-level objective. Notice how this doesn't just lazily list average response times, it demands an expected median response of 50 to 90 milliseconds, but it explicitly puts a ceiling on that tail response, the p95, at 500 to 800 milliseconds. You need a rock-solid latency budget for every single network hop if you ever want to meet your overall business-level p95 goals.
And hey, when that tail latency inevitably blows up and you are sweating in the middle of a major outage, you have to remember this golden rule. Mitigate now, investigate tomorrow. Never ever try to forward fix during an outage. Trying to patch a root cause bug while you've got the adrenaline rush of a production failure going almost always introduces a second bug. Just roll back, load shed, or scale up to restore the p95 latency. You can save the deep architectural debugging for the next morning when you have a clear head. So I'm going to leave you with this final provocative thought. Right after this explainer, go open up your monitoring tools. Ask yourself honestly, are you just optimizing your mean latency to make your charts look nice and pretty? Or are you truly obsessing over the p95 tail that your users actually feel? Because the hard truth of distributed systems is this: if you aren't managing the tail, you aren't managing performance at all. Thanks for hanging out with us, and keep your eyes on those percentiles.